Another day, another seeming downturn in the United States and Russia relations. Now, this time, it is Russia's sentencing of WNBA basketball star Brittney Griner to a 9-year prison term for having hashish oil at the Moscow airport. That incident took place back in February, but just here in this month of August, the sentencing from a Russian court handing down that 9-year prison term to Brittney Griner. Now, obviously, there are deep geopolitical reasons and implications behind this. And for a bit more on some of those, Dr. Christophe, a professor at CU Denver who teaches about European and post-Soviet politics, joins us once again for a look at the Brittney Griner case and an overall look, by the way, also as well at U.S. and Russia relations in regards to the war in Ukraine. Dr. Stefes, you join us here from Europe. Thank you so much for joining us here again.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Well, first of all, Dr. Stefes, I want to ask you about the Brittney Griner case. 9 years for what would seem to be a relatively minor offense. She pleaded guilty. She admitted her guilt here. 9 years for less than a gram of hashish oil. This appears to be a politically charged, a geopolitically charged sentencing. Is that not correct?
I think this is very correct. When you look at Soviet history just before Putin, we had something that was called telephone justice, so that where the party officials would actually call up the judges in political cases and already tell them what they are supposed to rule. And it was a little bit better under Yeltsin, so in the early 90s into 2000. But then under Putin, we see the same happening again, that the courts are very much under the control of the Kremlin in political cases, but also in high-profile economic cases when, for instance, companies are taken by the state and given to some of the oligarchs. In all of these cases, we know that the courts are not neutral. So this is very much a political ruling.
And so with that in mind, what is the leverage or what is Russia hoping to gain out of Brittney Griner being locked up in a Russian jail?
Well, I think that eventually this swap that President Biden has suggested will actually happen, but not right now, because Russia would essentially lose its face, or Putin especially would lose face if he just agreed right away to this swap. But most of all right now is simply, I think it's sticking it to the big guy. This is how I see it. And Russia is on the defensive, and we're going to probably talk about this a little bit later. I think you can see that Russia is in a very clear defensive position right now, and they try every leverage that there is.
And when you say defensive, are you speaking to their geopolitical standing with a bit more of an isolationist approach, or is it the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, which continues to be a bit of a slog for the Russians? How do you mean that?
Well, it's a little bit of everything, right? Geopolitically, Sweden and Finland and the US Senate just ratified this, is going to join NATO. That is something that Russia probably never wanted. We see that worldwide, the support for Russia is kind of lukewarm. Even the Chinese are not really supportive of Russia. They're dealing now with Taiwan. That's a totally different story. And on the battlefield, you actually see that Russia is in the defensive. They're trying to get some foothold in the east, but at the same time, they seem to be losing in the south. The Ukrainians using these Western modern weapons very efficiently, very effectively, hitting the Russian supply lines. And I think this is hurting Russia. And Russia has a really hard time right now resupplying the soldiers that have died or have been wounded on the battlefield.
You just kind of alluded to it. How would you characterize the overall state of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
I would say it's a little bit of a stalemate right now, something that I had not expected. I have to be very frank. You and I talked about it like over half a year ago. I expected the Russians to take over very quick, and they didn't. And I think right now the Russian support or the Ukrainian support provided by the West is really making a difference. So it's a stalemate, and maybe even that the Ukrainians might be able to actually regain some of the lost territory.
Fascinating indeed. I know this may be a little early for a question like this, but
Mm,
when does this conflict ultimately end? Is there any sight of that? And if so, how does it end?
mm. Well, we have a huge debate currently in Europe and also to some degree in the United States that we have to offer Russia a deal, like kind of a ramp off. And I think that's a wrong approach. Russia will not agree to any concessions at this point. It clearly needs to see and realize that the longer it stays away from negotiations, the more territory it will lose. So we have to arm the Ukrainians to a degree that the Russians realize that at this point, or in a month or two, if they are continuing staying away from discussing any kind of solution, any kind of negotiation, they will actually lose more than they currently do. That's a very rational, and I mean Putin is not irrational. So Putin wants to gain something, and we have to make sure that it is as little as possible.
Indeed, interesting, of course, in the grand scheme of things. Anything else to add about the Brittney Griner case, the Russia-U.S. relations, and kind of the geopolitical implications of all that as a whole?
Well, it's actually sad. There is no real reason for this United States and Russia, I mean, other than Putin, of course, for this bad relationship. I mean, we had a peace agreement for Europe after 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the collapse of communism. We could be somewhere else right now, and everyone is suffering economically. At the gas station, Americans, Europeans are suffering. Inflation is spiraling. People in the global south, are starving. And I find it very, very unnecessary. And we would be in a much better place if Putin at some point had been, taken off power. Meaning through regime change. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened yet.
I'll put on, before we end here, let me put on my optimist hat for a quick second here. And taking a look, and you mentioned Sweden and Finland joining NATO and the slog that's going on in eastern Ukraine. And you mentioned that Putin is a rational man. Is there any chance that he has, quote unquote, learned his lesson here, and that there could be maybe a warming of things once this conflict is over? Again, I'm putting on rose-colored glasses here, but is there any chance of that happening?
No, I don't think that any warming, defreezing of this new Cold War could happen under Vladimir Putin, for sure not. And not even under any of his successors that come out of his inner circle. This country needs a new leadership, and a strong leadership, but it has to be new and has to be more friendly towards the West, for sure.
Well, I certainly try, but unfortunately, yes, this is the state of the world. But Dr. Christophe, Stefes, on a positive note, we certainly appreciate a few minutes of your time. Your expertise is always, you're always a pleasure to chat with, even with some of these darker issues. But we certainly appreciate a few minutes of your time here on 9 News Plus.
Thank you for having me.